Hello, sentient life forms and content trolling algorithms. You've either stumbled on or returned to the fiber-rich cornucopia of RPG culture that I like to call Myth Brigade. My name is Jason, and I'm a GM, editor, a master procrastinator here on the channel, and I'm going to be jawing at you for a little while today as we continue our coverage of Savage Worlds Adventure Edition from the word-slinging wizards over at Pinnacle Entertainment. In particular, we're going to be continuing our deep dive into situational rules that flesh out the combat system so you can address all the unique and delicious kinds of violence. Now, if you haven't been following this Rules Bite series, make sure to check out episodes 1 through 6 so you'll be tracking with all the rules we've covered so far. Now, in the meanwhile, we'd best be getting to getting while the getting's good. But first, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and click that subscribe button to show your support for our community. Truly, that one little click does wonders in getting the word out. Whether it's energy draining spells, exposure to the elements, or just going long periods of time without food and water, there are situations when a character can become fatigued. Now, this is described in 3 levels, beginning with fatigued, which impairs the character's actions with a penalty of -1. If another level of fatigue is taken, the character's state worsens to exhausted, with a -2 penalty to all actions. Now, the final level of fatigue is incapacitation, which basically renders the character unable to act, and maybe even unconscious. Recovery from fatigued and exhausted conditions occurs naturally at a rate of 1 level per hour, assuming the character doesn't continue to push themselves. Incapacitated characters are out of commission for 2d6 hours, either unconscious or just rolling around in a helpless state. Now, treatment may be possible, but this depends on the type of fatigue and effect. If it's allowed, another character must make a healing check coupled with hydration, food, or an appropriate curative. Now, page 125 of the core rules details the recovery process for hazards like hunger, thirst, heat stroke, and so on. If the recovery attempt uses a power, you'll refer to the rules in the powers description. One last note, it is possible to stack fatigue from more than one source. So in this case, natural recovery removes a single level when the shortest duration expires, and another coinciding with the longest duration. You gonna kill me, ain't you? Yep. Maybe an enemy has been rendered unconscious by a magical sleep spell. Maybe they're bound and therefore have the vulnerable condition. Whatever the cause, completely helpless victims can be killed at the GM's discretion by performing the finishing move action. Now, this is typically done up close and personal with something like a point-blank headshot or maybe a snap of the neck. More distant attacks would probably call for a shooting roll and introduce a chance of missing. Now, GMs, you may want to disallow this rule for enemies in heavy armor or major baddies who may need to live to fight another day, as we see in the superhero rules. But if you're dealing with extras or villains that are on their very last leg, finishing move provides a great dramatic end. Many combat situations will mix the up-close and personal chaos of melee battles with ranged attacks. Now, shooting into a sword fight, a fist fight, or a full-on grappling match is a risky affair and carries some pretty heavy penalties. Now, to resolve these situations, we use the innocent bystander rules found on page 102. We'll cover those in detail in a moment, but for now, just know that shooters can't ignore the confusion that occurs when combatants are fighting in melee. Now, players, this is a really good time to remember your bennies. Your companions will thank you. Edges like counterattack and first strike permit a player to make a free attack. This is also allowed in situations where a combatant is withdrawing from a fight, which we'll cover later. Now, free attacks are raw attacks made without the benefit of any other edges or special combat options. They could be any form of melee attack or shooting attack if the character's armed with a weapon that can fire into melee. And yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Now, GMs, the takeaway here for you and your players is to know when to call for free attacks and to underscore that those attacks can't be modified with special edges. The rules for ganging up allow allied attackers to flank an enemy and, well, gang up, and overwhelm, confuse, and quickly dispatch them. Now let's take this one to the table. Here we have Sir Langley facing off against Mort the Goblin. At first, our green friend seems as if he's sure to lose. That is, until his ally Vort arrives and turns the tide. Now thanks to the rules for ganging up, both goblins now gain a +1 bonus to fighting rolls against the knight. More goblins pour out of their warrens, adding an additional +1 bonus as they flank Langley. Note that this caps at +4, so the 6 additions don't really count, other than having turns to attack. So in this round, all goblins gain a +4 bonus along with any other bonuses they may have in effect. After a round of fever-pitch battle and smart use of his edges, Sir Langley has managed to slay 3 of the 6 goblins. Their bonus for ganging up is therefore reduced to +2. Moments later, Gwen and Samir arrive to assist the good knight, restoring the balance and canceling out 2 points of ganging up, 1 per ally adjacent to the defender. And the rest is pretty much up to the dice. Grappling combat pits 2 combatants against one another using opposed athletics checks or an opposed test of strength at -2. If the attacker is successful, the defender takes on the entangled condition. If the defender is already entangled, or if the attacker gets a raise on the check, the defender then becomes bound. Now for the specifics on entangled and bound conditions, check out our last video, or turn to page 98 in the core rules. Now, before we move on, there are a couple of details here worth noting. First, if a foe becomes bound, the act of holding that grapple causes the attacker to become vulnerable as well. So players, be careful grappling if your opponent has allies nearby. Next, the gang up bonus we just reviewed applies to grapple attacks as usual. But other combat maneuvers like the drop, disarm, or setting specific ones do not unless specified by the GM. Now grappling becomes more difficult if your adversary is larger than you, or if they're significantly smaller. So to handle this, the grappler subtracts the difference in his enemy's size rating from his grappling check. So a human, or normal sized being, attempts to grapple with a wild pig or another small creature. They would take a -2 on the athletics check for size alone. Oh, and one special note, it isn't usually possible for an attacker to grapple a creature more than 2 sizes larger unless they're assisted by some special ability, magic item, or naturally long reach. Finally, a grappler can cause injury by crushing a foe once he's inflicted a bound or entangled condition. So to do this requires an opposed strength check as an action on the attacker's turn. Success deals the grappler's strength die and damage, with bonus damage and raises allowed. Now GM, the book doesn't really mention it, but keep an eye out for failures here. I think a failed attempt to injure a foe like this might improve a bound condition to entangled. Maybe a critical failure even allows the enemy to escape entirely. Most game systems offer some concession for holding actions, but the Savage Worlds approach is pretty fantastic. Instead of acting on his or her initiative, a character may choose to go on hold. Now this allows them to wait and see what happens as the initiative continues. When they see a clear path to action, they can then jump back into the fray. Now, characters on hold at the beginning of a new turn are skipped when dealing action cards, and instead they remain on hold for the next turn. Now, to keep things organized and balanced, there are a couple of nuances that we should cover. First, if a character is shaken or stunned, they immediately fall out of that hold status. Now, I would argue that this should apply to distracted as well, but that may be more of a house rule. Next, it's possible for an on-hold character to interrupt the action of another character or adversary. This requires an opposed athletics check, with the highest roll getting to act first. I think this is pretty fair. And ties are resolved simultaneously.
Oh, you think that's gonna help you? All right. Yeah. Oh. Gotcha.
Darkness has a major impact on any action requiring the use of sight. That is, if the character or creature requires it. So shooting, fighting, notice, use of powers, you name it, various levels of darkness will carry penalties ranging from a -2 when operating in dim light to a whopping -6 in complete darkness. Now, as with so many others, this penalty would stack with any other modifiers a character would face on a given action. Now, GMs, keep in mind that a lack of light may actually help with certain actions, like a character hiding or trying to frighten a less intelligent enemy by making scary noises in a dark cavern. So, in these cases, maybe consider giving the character's skill check a bonus, or just penalize the enemy's fear check in the latter case. Either way, think about darkness as a double-edged sword. Smiling like a possum, chewing barbed wire. Boo! The hell you mean, boo? I wrote that song.
Play something different.
Yeah, I could play a different song. How about I play the one called Cowboy Beats the Living Hell Out of a Son Bitch with a Ukulele? Get out that chair and let's get it done. Sometimes a character may find themselves without a proper weapon. And in this case, they may need to choose something from the environment to get by in a given combat. Now, this could be an empty rifle or a pistol, a table leg, a barrel of ale, a precious vase, the list goes on. The rules for handling this are pretty simple. First, fighting rolls or athletics rolls for thrown objects are made at -2 along with any other penalties in play. Range, damage, and the strength required to wield the weapon are then looked up on page 102, and the attack is resolved normally. Now, GMs, make sure to think about the material the object's made out of. You may need to modify damage if it's something soft. Also, I'd argue you might want to assign a number of attacks the weapon is capable of enduring before it becomes useless. A large flower vase, for example, would only be good for a single attack. Well, I guess you could turn it into a dagger after that. But then a metal chair might hold together for the majority of combat. Now, players, keep in mind the minimum strength rating doesn't mean your character can't pick up the object or even throw it. Rather, it decides if your character can comfortably wield or throw it to damaging effect. Now, GMs, you may consider waiving this in favor of a steeper penalty if the attack isn't dependent on the character's strength. So maybe the player's dropping something heavy out of a window or off of a balcony, or slinging a concrete block from a moving car. See? I told you we'd get there. From time to time, heroes or villains may decide to attack a target that's in a crowd or otherwise adjacent to friendly or at least uninvolved targets. A good example of this would be shooting an arrow into an intense melee where a few of the character's allies are clashing blades with a group of enemies. Now, to handle this scenario, we have a few considerations. First, when shooting into a crowd or similar situation, characters rolling a 1 on the trait die hit a random victim adjacent to the original target. Note that wild cards must also miss with the wild die for this to take effect. Not necessarily a 1, they just have to miss. Now, here's a quick table example to cement the difference. Thrak, a wild card, has knocked up an arrow and is hoping to kill this goblin, who is currently trading blows with Mirsha, his elfin friend. Kieran and Orville are also in the mix, trading blows with these goblins. To complicate things, Guch, a goblin slinger, has popped up in these rocks and is also preparing a shot. He's an extra. Thrak fires, rolling a 1 on the shooting die and a 2 on the wild die. Had the wild die hit, he would have been okay, but this result means he hits a random target next to the intended foe. On his turn, Guch hurls a stone, also rolling a 1 on the shooting die. Since there's no wild die, he didn't have an out. He will also hit an unintended target. One complication to the innocent bystander rules involves shotguns or scattering weapons, as well as weapons with a high rate of fire. Firing into a melee or crowds with these is much more difficult, and as such, a bystander is hit on a roll of a 1 or a 2 on the trait die. Characters in Savage Worlds travel by horses, camels, dragons, alien creatures, motorcycles, and the occasional enlarged goat. In Worlds of High Adventure, mounted combat's pretty much commonplace, so the core rules have a few things to say about it. First, characters attempting to fight while mounted must use the lower of their fighting or riding skills when trying to hit an enemy. So players, this really isn't great if you're not that solid at riding. Maybe better to hang on for dear life, park, and then kill the bad guy. If a character becomes shaken, stunned, or wounded while on their mount, or if that mount is incapacitated, the GM then calls for a riding roll to avoid that character falling off. Failure here means they're thrown and take 2d4 damage. A critical failure increases that damage to 2d6. Ranged attacks against mounted opponents follow the rules for innocent bystander. That is, when making such an attack, a roll of 1 on the shooting die misses the opponent but strikes the mount. Mounts that become shaken or wounded by this means, or any other attack, buck and thrash, causing the need for a riding roll. Now GMs, keep in mind the size and power of the mount as well as how familiar the character is with that specific creature. Depending on the situation, you may want to up the ante with some penalties, or maybe even throw the occasional kindness bonus. Just a couple more quick notes on mounted combat. First, riders charging their mounts add +4 to damage on any successful fighting attack. Now, this requires that the character have moved at least 6 inches or 6 squares in a straightish path toward the target. This represents building up enough momentum in that charge to deliver that more savage blow. Next, and maybe the most tricky in mounted combat, is the concept of setting weapons. Now, a weapon with a reach of 1 or greater, so a spear, a halberd, a lance, or something of the sort, can be set against an oncoming charge. Now, this requires that the character be on hold and close enough to the approaching rider. Also, that character must successfully interrupt the rider's initiative with an opposed athletics check following the rules we discussed for being on hold. On this roll, a +2 is awarded to the combatant who's got the weapon with the longest reach. Now, the winner of this athletics check gets to make an attack roll, adding that +4 bonus to damage. So, if the rider wins the test, the character's trying to get the weapon set, but doesn't quite get there and takes the brunt of the charge. If the defender wins, that spear or polearm comes up just in time and hits the rider. Characters can attempt up to 3 actions in a single turn, but each action beyond the first one comes with a stacking -2 penalty to all action. So 1 action, no penalty. 2 actions, -2 to each action. 3 actions, -4 penalty on each action. All actions have to be declared before any dice are rolled, and once set, penalties persist for all actions. Now, this is the case even if the character changes their mind or if one of the declared actions can't be taken for some reason. Now, players, keep in mind, you can spread out actions within your movement. So shoot this guy, move here, pull the crazy lever, move there, close the blast door just in time. Just remember, once you start a chain like that, there's no escaping those penalties.
Nice pistol. But look at these babies.
Some creatures have natural weapons like teeth, claws, horns, or whip-like tails. Now, these beasties are always considered armed, so the unarmed defender and 2-weapon fighting situations don't really apply to them as they might others. Now, we'll cover those in a little bit more detail next time, but in the meanwhile, let's just talk about some of the nuances of their natural attacks. Now, first, creatures with bite attacks get a benefit when grappling. That is, instead of just being able to crush an opponent, they can use their full bite attack on any grappled opponent. Now, creatures with claws gain a +2 bonus to athletics checks when climbing any non-smooth surface. Smooth or sheer surfaces don't really have enough texture for claws to gain purchase, so the character would just... Horned creatures are able to couple their natural weapon with a charge attack, adding +4 to damage if they're able to move at least 5 inches or squares to build up the momentum for the charge. Now, sometimes you don't want to kill an opponent. You just want to bit out of them and teach them a fucking lesson. Assuming the character is attacking with a blunt weapon, fists or feet, the rules allow for the concept of non-lethal damage. Now, edge weapons can be used, but avoiding lethal harm imposes a -1 penalty on the fighting roll. Now, players beware, critical failure here can mean you accidentally lop the combatant's head off rather than swatting them with the flat of that blade. Non-lethal damage still uses the wound mechanic, but instead of causing death, a stack of non-lethal wounds just knocks the opponent unconscious. In Savage Worlds, all characters are assumed to have a dominant hand, typically the right one. If a player attempts an action that requires coordination with his or her offhand, that action suffers a -2 penalty. Now, likewise, weapons used with the offhand don't benefit from any parry bonus they may normally impart. Now, note that the ambidextrous edge cancels all of these out. Characters can wind up in a prone position in a number of ways, some defensive, some the result of being knocked down. While prone, ranged attacks against the character suffer a -4 penalty to hit when firing from a range of 3 inches, or 3 squares, or greater. Also, ranged attacks are less effective against prone characters, subtracting 4 from damage. So all good news, right? Well, sort of. Characters who find themselves prone in a melee are easier to hit and have a tough time fighting back, suffering a -2 penalty to parry and -2 on any fighting rolls.
And I'm gonna push you.
I'm gonna push you.
I'll push you, kid. Straight.
Go chest bump.
Chest
bump.
So we talked about a good beatdown with non-lethal damage, but what if a character wants to push an opponent out of the way, or off a cliff, or in front of an oncoming bus? Pushing an opponent requires an opposed strength roll. If the pusher is successful, the victim is shoved back up to 1 inch, or 1 square on the table. With the raise, this distance is doubled. If the pusher's scale is greater than the pushee, both of these values are doubled, so 2 inches for a regular and 4 inches with a raise. In every case, the pushed opponent must make a successful athletics roll to navigate the stumble or also be knocked prone. Now, characters can add a little oomph to their pushes in the form of a +2 bonus by getting a running start, that is, running at least 2 inches or 2 squares on the table before that push attempt occurs. Next, always keep size in mind when resolving pushes. Creatures aren't usually able to push targets more than 2 sizes larger than themselves without the aid of an item, a power, a bulldozer, or maybe a setting-specific racial trait. Now, GMs, this is your call in the end, but keep this in mind and choose wisely. A couple of last points on push. First, pushers and pushees may choose to use the athletics skill in place of strength when making that opposed roll. And finally, characters using shields in that push attack or that push defense should add the shield's parry bonus to their strength or athletics roll. Combatants may use ranged weapons in melee, so long as they adhere to some important limitations. First, only powers or one-handed firearms are allowed in melee scenarios. Anything larger is just too unwieldy for close quarters. Next, the target number for the shooting rolls made in melee is the target's parry rather than the usual ranged modified TN. Lastly, a character wielding a firearm in melee takes on the vulnerable action if he attacks a target outside of that melee. Now, this makes sense because the character would then be taking their attention off of the chaos of the fisticuffs to get a bead on that external target on the nearby rooftop. Using a free action, characters can ready up to 2 items. Now, think of this as drawing a pistol, unshouldering a battle axe, or any other maneuver that can be done in a pretty simple, fluid movement. Now, players take note, more complex situations would need to consume a normal action. Now, these would be things like retrieving an item from a backpack, picking up an item from a felled enemy that enemy is laying on, or any other situation that would require more time and more movement. I personally prefer to be a little lenient on action economy here, so long as the players are being reasonable and not trying to game the system. Weapons with a rate of fire greater than 1 cause recoil if multiple shots are fired in a single action. Now, this causes a -2 penalty for the shooting rolls associated with each shot inside of that action. Note, these penalties don't stack from action to action, so characters with multiple actions can take multiple rapid fire shots, applying only the -2 penalty to each shooting roll. Now, likewise, a character could use 1 action for a rapid fire attack, followed by a single shot with the second action. All right, we made it to the end of part 2 of our coverage of the Situational Rules in Savage Worlds Adventure Edition. We'll finish this up next episode and move on to some tips and tactics for GMs known as the Adventure Toolkit. If you got something out of today's episode, or if you just had a bit of a laugh along the way, please make a finishing move on that like button. Leave us a comment below. And yeah, go ahead and subscribe for more Rules Bites, office hours, game reviews, and live play sessions right here on Myth Brigade. Your support goes a long way into growing this community and keeping us in this content business. Thanks so much for watching and supporting us as we continue to grow. And until next time, I believe someone might have some parting words of wisdom.
Letting the cat out of the bag's a hell of a lot easier than putting it back in.